A civilization can survive the death of its institutions, but not the death of legitimacy. That was the riddle of Europe in the late 8th century AD. Rome was gone in the West, yet Rome still ruled the imagination. Into that vacuum stepped Charlemagne, a conqueror remembered as the father of Europe, but better understood as something more unsettling, a ruler who tried to resurrect a dead empire and, by doing so, created an entirely different world. By the time Charlemagne emerged, Europe was not a continent in any modern political sense. It was a fractured post-imperial zone, a landscape of lordships, ethnic confederations, unstable frontiers, and sacred claims competing for obedience. The Roman Empire in the West had collapsed centuries earlier, but collapse does not erase prestige. It leaves ruins in law, memory, language, and ambition. Roman roads still shaped movement. Roman Christianity still shaped imagination. Roman titles still suggested authority. But the actual Roman machinery of taxation, bureaucracy, and urban coordination had long since withered away. The name endured more powerfully than the structure. That was the strategic environment into which the Carolingians rose. The earlier Merovingian order had decayed in the way exhausted dynasties often do. Their king still possessed lineage, but lineage alone cannot discipline armed aristocrats, cannot answer frontier threats, and cannot reward followers at the scale required by a violent age. Therefore power migrated toward those who could command armies and make victory profitable. The Carolingians succeeded first not because they possessed superior mythology, but because they possessed superior functionality. They could organize war, distribute spoils, and turn military usefulness into political supremacy. Pepin III, Charlemagne's father, had already built the essential foundation. He took the Carolingian rise beyond mere palace politics and gave it sacred framing. By securing papal sanction for his kingship, Pepin fused force with legitimacy in a form that would define his son's world. This was not a decorative blessing. It was a strategic innovation. In a fragmented post-Roman landscape, no ruler could rely on naked coercion alone. Aristocrats had to be bound. Clergy had to be persuaded. Subjects had to understand why obedience served a higher order. The alliance with Rome offered a solution. Frankish military power would protect the church, and the church would sanctify Frankish rule. The sword and the altar entered into partnership. But the papacy was not floating above politics as a purely spiritual institution. It was trapped inside hard geopolitics. Lombard pressure in Italy threatened Rome. The Byzantine Empire, still Roman in its own understanding, remained distant, preoccupied, and increasingly culturally estranged from Latin elites. Constantinople might claim universal empire, but claims made at great distance lose force when armies do not arrive. Therefore the bishops of Rome looked northward. The Franks looked southward. Their interests converged not from sentiment, but from necessity. Meanwhile the larger strategic map had been transformed by the rise of Islamic power. The Mediterranean, once the integrating heart of the Roman world, no longer functioned in the same way for Latin Christendom. Old assumptions about trade, naval centrality, and imperial cohesion had been shattered. To the northeast stood the Saxons, decentralized, stubborn, and difficult to subdue because their political fragmentation made decisive victory elusive. To the southeast loomed the Avar Khaganate, rich, dangerous, and deeply relevant to the balance of power in Central Europe. To the south lay Muslim Al-Andalus, formidable, sophisticated, and a reminder that the Iberian frontier was part of a broader civilizational contest. To the east stood Byzantine prestige, still potent, still ancient, and still capable of making any Western imperial claim look like audacity dressed as inheritance. Charlemagne therefore inherited not a stable kingdom, but a pressure system. The question was larger than territory. Who had the right to define order in a post-Roman world? Who could protect the church, command aristocrats, Christianize frontiers, suppress rivals, and present power not merely as domination, but as universal responsibility? Europe was starving for legitimacy, terrified of fragmentation, and primed for a ruler who could turn victory into a civilizational blueprint. Charlemagne's genius is often reduced to conquest, but conquest alone explains very little. Many warlords win battles. Few convert battlefield success into durable political architecture. His true talent was synthesis. He fused annual campaigning, religious policy, aristocratic management, and administrative reform into a coherent strategy of expansion and control. This did not create a bureaucratic empire in the Roman sense. But it did create something highly adaptive to the conditions of the age. That system rested on motion. Carolingian government was itinerant. Royal authority traveled. Assemblies gathered elites. Oaths tied men to ruler and realm. Counts governed localities in the king's name. Bishops and abbots served not only sacred purposes, but also administrative and political ones. Royal envoys, the missi dominici, moved through the realm to inspect, correct, and remind local powers that authority was watching. The state was not a fixed machine. It was a network of supervision, negotiation, intimidation, and ritual. This was the central strategic problem of Charlemagne's age. How does a ruler govern vast, culturally varied lands without a large standing bureaucracy? His answer was elegant and severe. The church would function as infrastructure. Conquest would function as financing. Roman memory would function as ideological cement. In a world short on institutions, belief itself became administrative technology. Religion in this system was never only inward conviction. Conversion meant incorporation into a legal, cultural, and political order legible to the crown and clergy. A newly Christianized people could be baptized, instructed, taxed indirectly through structures of obligation, disciplined through moral law, and integrated through clerical literacy. That is why missionaries followed armies. That is why monasteries mattered. That is why corrected texts and standardized liturgy were not side notes to empire, but part of its nervous system. Yet no ideology survives without logistics. Charlemagne's ambition was constrained by harvest cycles, horse supply, aristocratic cooperation, rivers, roads, weather, local intelligence, and the seasonal realities of campaigning. Grand strategy in this era was inseparable from the practical ability to assemble men, move them, feed them, and reward them. A Frankish ruler who campaigned successfully enriched followers. A ruler who failed too often weakened the bonds of loyalty that made future campaigns possible. Therefore war was not simply external action. It was the internal engine of Carolingian politics. This explains why Charlemagne campaigned so relentlessly. It was not merely personal appetite for glory, though ambition plainly mattered. It was structural. The regime depended on movement, victory, and redistribution. Every successful expedition reaffirmed hierarchy. Every triumph generated prestige and spoils. Every redistribution of land, treasure, and ecclesiastical favor reinforced a coalition of nobles, clerics, and royal agents whose fortunes were tied to the crown. The first major turning point came in Italy. In AD 774, Charlemagne destroyed Lombard independence and assumed the Lombard crown. This event was more than conquest. It changed the geometry of power. The Franks were no longer simply a northern kingdom with influence over Rome. They became decisive actors within Italy itself. That meant direct relevance to the Roman Church, direct proximity to old imperial symbolism, and direct involvement in a region where the language of universal authority still carried unusual force. The Lombard campaign revealed several features of Charlemagne's method. First, he moved under a banner of protection and legitimacy, not merely expansion. To defend the papacy was to make force appear restorative rather than predatory. Second, he converted victory into title. Taking the Lombard crown allowed annexation to look like lawful succession under Christian order. Third, he avoided the error of simple devastation followed by neglect. Italy was too politically symbolic for that. It had to be absorbed into the Carolingian vision of rulership. Charlemagne was not only seizing territory. He was collecting claims. But if Italy elevated him, Saxony tested him. From AD 772 to AD 804, the Saxon Wars became the crucible of Carolingian statecraft. Here the glamour of imperial memory met the brutal arithmetic of frontier control. The Saxons were not an empire waiting to be decapitated. They were decentralized, resilient, and socially configured in a way that made conquest maddeningly incomplete. A king could defeat one coalition, but another would arise. A sanctuary could be destroyed, but resistance would return. Submission could be sworn, but oaths made under pressure did not guarantee loyalty once armies withdrew. Therefore the Saxon struggle became a long war of repeated invasion, punitive retaliation, deportation, forced conversion, hostage-taking, legal coercion, and exemplary terror. This is where sentimental portraits of Charlemagne collapse. The same ruler celebrated for learning, liturgical reform, and civilizational renewal also presided over extraordinary violence in the name of integration. The logic was chillingly clear. A frontier people who could not be trusted to remain neutral, and could not be quickly annihilated through a single decisive campaign, would have to be remade. Conquest sought not merely obedience, but transformation. One of the most revealing features of the Saxon Wars is how clearly they exposed the relationship between faith and state formation. Christianization was not simply a matter of saving souls. It was a mechanism for ending alternative centers of loyalty. Sacred groves, cults, customs, and warrior bonds carried political meaning. To break them was to break a rival order. Capitulary law imposed Christian norms with astonishing severity because deviation was interpreted not merely as impiety, but as sedition. But coercion produced backlash. Therefore the Frankish solution intensified the very cycle it sought to end. Rebellion justified harsher repression. Harsher repression generated deeper memory. The frontier was pacified only through decades of strain and moral compromise. The most infamous episode, the massacre at Verdun in AD 782, has endured because it captures the core contradiction of Charlemagne's project. Here was a ruler constructing Christian empire by means starkly at odds with Christian mercy. Defenders have long argued strategic necessity. Critics have seen unvarnished brutality. Both interpretations point toward the same truth: state formation on contested frontiers often presents itself as moral order while relying on organized terror. The Carolingian world was not born in innocence. Yet the Saxon Wars also displayed why Charlemagne remained effective despite overreach. He did not rely solely on massacre and fear. He settled loyal elements, supported missionary structures, reorganized territories, and embedded conquered zones within broader frameworks of countship, church supervision, and oath-bound hierarchy. This was not chaos masquerading as rule. It was harsh method. The frontier had to become legible. It had to become taxable in obligation, governable in law, and intelligible within the Christian political universe. If Saxony revealed the regime's strengths and moral brutalities, the campaign in Spain in AD 778 exposed its limits. Later legend transformed the retreat through Roncesvalles into epic memory, but the strategic significance lies elsewhere. The expedition demonstrated that ambition could outrun reliable control. Politics in Iberia were too complex, local alliances too unstable, and the terrain of power too fragmented for simple Carolingian projection. The rearguard's destruction by Basque forces was not a civilization-ending disaster. But it was a warning. A ruler can extend prestige faster than administration. The map can flatter ambition long before it obeys it. This distinction matters because empires often mistake reach for control. Charlemagne could intervene across enormous spaces, but intervention was not the same as durable incorporation. His greatest successes came where military operations could be linked to redistribution, church integration, and elite management over time. Where those elements were thin, conquest produced reputation more than order. Spain, in that sense, was a lesson in the fog of war. Information was imperfect. Local actors were opportunistic. Strategic windows could close suddenly. Even a powerful ruler governed amid uncertainty. The campaigns against the Avars in the 790s AD, by contrast, offered enormous reward. The Avar Khaganate had long been a force in Central Europe, but internal weakness and external pressure made it vulnerable. Carolingian offensives, combined with regional dynamics that destabilized Avar cohesion, led to the collapse and plunder of its power centers. The treasure seized was immense in both material and political terms. Wealth flooded into the Carolingian system. Followers could be rewarded. Churches could be endowed. Monasteries could be enriched. Royal favor could take visible form across the realm. This was conquest functioning as fiscal policy. In a world without modern taxation systems capable of routinely extracting and redistributing wealth on a Roman scale, spectacular victories supplied the regime with distributable abundance. Treasure was not merely greed satisfied. It was loyalty financed. It was legitimacy made tangible. Every gift to a noble house, every endowment to a bishopric, every patronage network strengthened by spoils turned distant campaigns into domestic stability. That pattern reveals the brilliance of Charlemagne's coalition management. Internal Frankish nobles could never be treated as passive instruments. Their support had to be continuously purchased, supervised, honored, and restrained. Great rulers in weakly bureaucratic societies do not eliminate elites, they orchestrate them. Therefore Charlemagne made aristocratic ambition dependent on royal success. Annual assemblies gave participation. Campaigns offered opportunity. Patronage offered reward. Royal envoys offered scrutiny. Ecclesiastical appointments offered another avenue for balancing family interests against central needs. Still, this balancing act contained a vulnerability. A system held together by a dominant ruler's charisma, energy, and military success can look stronger than it truly is. The more one man animates the machinery, the harder it becomes to know whether the machinery can survive without him. This would matter immensely after AD 814. But before that reckoning came the most famous scene of the reign. Christmas Day, AD 800. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor in Rome. It remains one of the most symbolically charged moments in European history because it was not merely a ceremony. It was a declaration about who had the authority to define civilization in the West. The title announced that universal empire could exist again outside Byzantine control. It transformed Frankish kingship into something grander, older, and more dangerous. It also raised immediate questions. Did the Pope confer empire, or recognize it? Did Charlemagne seek the title, tolerate it, or stage manage it? Was this restoration, innovation, or appropriation? The answer is that it was all three at once. That is why the moment mattered so deeply. To the papacy, the coronation strengthened an alliance with the one military power capable of defending Rome and implied that sacred authority could elevate secular rulers. To Charlemagne, it wrapped conquests in Roman grandeur and suggested a universal mission beyond tribal kingship. To Byzantium, it was provocation, a Western claim to Roman inheritance under new management. To later Europe, it changed the political grammar. Kingship no longer seemed the highest imaginable office. The imperial idea had returned to the West, and every major power now had to position itself in relation to that claim. But the coronation also exposed a central paradox. Charlemagne did not restore the Roman Empire in any literal institutional sense. He lacked the tax system, urban infrastructure, bureaucratic density, and Mediterranean command that had once sustained Roman universality. Therefore the crown of empire sat atop a radically different structure: Christian, militarized, aristocratic, land-based, decentralized, and personal. The corpse of Rome had not been revived. It had been repurposed. This is the key to understanding Charlemagne's greatness. He did not truly resurrect antiquity. He harvested its prestige. He took Roman memory, Christian sanction, Frankish warfare, and local aristocratic networks, then fused them into a new model of rule. That model would become recognizably medieval Europe. It depended less on urban civic institutions and more on personal bonds. Less on impersonal administration and more on layered obligation. Less on old imperial continuity and more on creative appropriation of the past. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance must be understood within this same frame. It is often described as a cultural awakening, which it was. But culture here was strategic. Script reform, corrected biblical and legal texts, palace schools, educational patronage, capitularies, and standardized liturgy all increased coherence across distance. Writing became a weapon of empire in the most profound sense. If officials could read more clearly, if prayers were performed more uniformly, if legal commands circulated in more reliable form, then the realm became more governable. Intellectual order and political order were reinforcing projects. Carolingian minuscule, for example, was not simply a prettier style of writing. It improved legibility and transmission. That matters enormously in a realm trying to project authority over varied regions through clerical networks. Correct texts reduce drift. Standard forms reduce confusion. Schools produce personnel capable of sustaining continuity. Therefore the Renaissance of letters was not detached from military empire. It was one of the tools that made imperial aspiration administratively plausible. The same can be said of liturgy and reform. Uniform worship is never only about devotion. It creates a shared symbolic language. It tells scattered communities that they belong to one sacred order. In an age where coercion could conquer but could not by itself stabilize, liturgical unity and clerical learning supplied a softer but indispensable form of integration. A realm becomes durable when its commands are not merely feared, but understood as normal. And yet there remained a profound structural weakness. Charlemagne's empire was highly personal. His authority rested on conquest, prestige, sacred aura, and the ability to arbitrate elite competition. Those qualities can dominate a lifetime, but they are difficult to inherit intact. After his death in AD 814, Louis the Pious inherited vast scale without equivalent command presence. This was not because Louis lacked seriousness or intention. It was because founder's authority and successor's authority are never the same currency. The empire had breadth, but its center was more fragile than the imperial title suggested. As pressures mounted, the Carolingian world moved toward dynastic fracture. Rivalries within the ruling family, regional interests among aristocracies, and the sheer challenge of governing enormous territories without dense bureaucratic institutions all pushed toward division. The Treaty of Verdun in AD 843 is often treated as a collapse of Charlemagne's dream, but that interpretation is too simple. Verdun did not erase the Carolingian project. It proved how consequential it had become. The inheritance was so powerful that its partition would shape the long development of France, Germany, and the entity later known as the Holy Roman Empire. That is the deepest irony. Charlemagne sought universal authority, but the political forms that emerged from his legacy were plural, contested, and regionally distinct. The imperial ideal endured, but so did the stubborn reality of fragmentation. Europe would spend centuries caught between these poles, the dream of universal Christian order and the fact of competing powers. Popes, emperors, kings, princes, bishops, and cities would all inherit the grammar he helped establish. Sacred legitimacy would remain politically explosive. Administrative clarity would remain a source of strength. Frontier management would remain brutal. Elite bargaining would remain indispensable. Medieval Europe was not discovered beneath the ruins of Rome. It was engineered through adaptation. This is why the phrase Father of Europe both captures and obscures the truth. It captures the scale of Charlemagne's influence. His reign changed the political vocabulary of the West. It linked kingship to imperial ambition, conquest to Christianization, and cultural reform to governance. But it obscures the cost. The making of this new Europe required coercion, deportation, punishment, forced conversions, and persistent war. Its unity was real, but never innocent. Its brilliance was real, but inseparable from violence. The verdict, then, is unsentimental. Charlemagne did not restore Rome. He replaced it. His true achievement was not resurrection, but reinvention. He took a world shattered by post-imperial fragmentation and gave it a new organizing formula: sacred legitimacy, aristocratic cooperation, military expansion, and administrative reform working in concert. That formula was strong enough to shape a continent, but not strong enough to abolish the personal and regional forces that would later divide it. The cost must be counted with clarity. Saxony was subdued, but through terror as well as governance. The papacy was protected, but at the price of entangling spiritual authority with imperial power. Learning was renewed, but in service to a political order built on war. The imperial crown elevated the West, but also planted a rivalry over legitimacy that would echo for centuries. Every civilizational blueprint carries both architecture and blood within its foundations. The modern mirror is impossible to ignore. Charlemagne's story is not merely about an early medieval king. It is the anatomy of political reinvention after collapse. It reveals that states do not endure on force alone, they require legitimacy, administrative reach, and stories that make obedience meaningful. It reveals that leaders invoke golden ages not to restore the past exactly, but to mobilize the present. It reveals that institutions of belief, education, and law can function as strategic infrastructure no less than roads or fortresses. And it reveals, with disturbing force, that campaigns of integration often present themselves as moral necessity while relying on coercion that later ages prefer to soften in memory. Modern societies still live inside these patterns. Political orders still borrow prestige from dead empires, dead constitutions, dead founders, and sacred narratives. States still attempt to weld diverse populations into coherent systems through schooling, law, ritual, bureaucracy, and selective violence. Elites still bargain beneath the language of principle. Frontiers still test the limits of idealism. Administrative capacity still determines whether grand rhetoric becomes durable power or evaporates into spectacle. The medieval case is distant in chronology, but uncomfortably near in logic. The final legacy question, then, is not whether Charlemagne deserves admiration or condemnation alone. History is rarely so simple. The sharper question is this: when civilizations claim to be restoring a lost order, are they recovering truth, or merely giving moral cover to the creation of something new and more ruthless than they admit? In that question lies the enduring power of Charlemagne's crown, not as a relic of Rome, but as a warning about what human beings build when memory, fear, and ambition decide to rule together.